All right. Let's get right into this. So I don't want this to be a super long video. I don't want this to be super complicated, but if you clicked on this, then you're probably either interested in American economics, international economics, startups, or venture capital in some way. And the U.S. economy tends to deal with a lot of those every day. And so really wanted to dive in, not trying to give any major opinions or, talk about how good or bad one candidate is. More than anything, just here's where things were, here's where things are at, and here's some things to keep an eye on, or at least what I'm going to be keeping an eye on over the next few years, and the things that I think Trump becoming president will for sure shape at least how things interact. So just wanted to start off quick little baseline. Whenever we've seen some huge growth in just the past few days, a major spike in the S&P 500 and Bitcoin. We'll get into that in a second. But for context, I like to follow the S&P 500. It seems to be a pretty good indicator of the markets as a whole, and one of the most popular ways to invest as an individual. So whenever Trump took over office from Obama in 2017, he started off at the S&P 500 being at 2271, and he ended his term in 2021 at 3798. So he gained 1,527 points over his presidency, and that's with COVID included. Whenever Biden took over, he started obviously at 3798, and whenever he hasn't finished yet, but I kind of stopped there right before Trump's president, November 6th, whenever he got elected as president for his second term. It stopped at 5712. So he's already gained a major gain of 1,914 points during his presidency, again, with COVID involved. So major gains, things are still going up, major economic growth, so good for both presidents. As an American, I have no desire for either president to fail because I live here. And I want my economy to prosper because, it helps me and everybody else. There's no good side to the economy collapsing or failing on itself. So hoping for this trend to continue. We'll see where Trump is at whenever he starts. But on that note, I did want to note the S&P 500, the day that Trump was elected, the 5 days after, we saw a 5% increase in the S&P 500 during that period from November 5th through the 11th. 43% increase in Bitcoin as well. Just quick shout out to Quantified. I'll put a link in the bio or a link in the description so that you can follow their newsletter. I love their newsletter. It's super awesome for not just keeping up with the financial times, but also seeing it more visually represented. So I'll put a nice little visual right here so you can see what we're talking about for the day after the spike. It looks like the only thing that didn't increase in value was real estate. I'm just from my real estate background, I'm assuming it's because everybody's assuming that real estate costs will go down as Trump comes into office, which is why they're pulling their money from it, which, depending on who you are, could be a great thing. I'm hoping more people in my generation will be able to afford homes, so this is a very good sign. Here's some things, before we move on to more of the international markets, some things that I'll be keeping an eye on, and we'll see what happens with Trump as he moves in. The first one is going to be NATO. I know his first term, I always trigger that thumbs up, but his first term, he talks a lot about either pulling out of NATO or working some sort of deal where the other members of NATO would pay back their dues, or just pay him direct, or pay the U.S. directly for protection, which in all honesty kind of sounds very like a mob boss. But I mean, if it works, and we stop footing the bill for all of Europe's protection, then hey, there's a benefit. If we can make it cash flow positive on the U.S. end, it sounds like a deal to me. Though I am very much anti going into more wars, but that's just personal opinion. When it comes to tariffs, it's a very dicey subject because you've got one end of people saying, yeah, let's tax the other countries that are using our markets to profit, but what they don't take into account is a lot of the times those taxes really come out of our own pockets, which very much depends on your opinion. I am very much okay with less taxes coming out of my own pocket and going to the U.S. government if it means other things become more expensive, because I can just not buy those other things that are not necessary and just reduce my Amazon order, and rather keep more of my money in my own pocket instead of giving it to the Federal Reserve or the Fed, federal government. Sorry, not the Federal Reserve. Giving it to the federal government. Because I don't think you have to be a rocket scientist to understand how poorly managed the money is that goes there. So I'd rather keep more money in my own pocket and have the choice of buying the more expensive things instead. So I'm kind of more leaning towards okay with that, but it is a double-edged sword. It very much can just make the price of everyday products more expensive. I believe, like the toilet paper thing. We're not going to get into that. Everything's going to get a little bit more expensive if that happens, but now you also have the choice of not. However, the theoretically good thing about it is it might move more manufacturing back stateside, which I am very much for. So hope for the best, prepare for the worst. That's all you really can do. Always hoping that the best outcome happens. The next one I wanted to touch on is the Department of Education. I think Trump yesterday just made an announcement. He's shutting down the let's call it nationwide Department of Education in favor of letting individual states kind of take things on as they're going. This one I will say I'm very much a big fan of. There is not a single metric that the Department of Education has improved since they came into being. So I'm very much for leaving it open to the states to kind of make those decisions and improve education along those lines, instead of having some nationwide government mandate of what has to be required. So hoping for the best again. We'll see what happens. Again, I don't think you can do much worse than the Department of Education's already done. Like attendance is down, like grades are down, or like reading levels are down, like everything is going the opposite way it should. So again, hoping for the best. I just kind of put fulfilling promises in general. Every politician makes 100 different promises along the campaign trail. We'll see what happens. We'll see. We need to find a better way of kind of quantifying how many promises he made and how many he keeps along it. There should be a better way where you can see every promise that a politician made and how often they keep them or not. So that would be a good way to keep them in check for anything, at least. Fiscal responsibility. We'll see. This kind of leads into the next point of, what are they calling it now? Doge, D-O-G-E. I think it's Elon Musk and Rand Paul are calling it the Department of Government Efficiency, which, okay, I got to give them props for the name of Doge. But what is it? We'll see how much they cut back. I think he made a wild claim of he's going to cut $2 trillion a year. I'm very much a big fan of small government, and I'd rather have more of the money going towards actual roads reconstruction instead of just going to everybody else, everything that doesn't need it or just being thrown around. I think there was some $2 million government study that happened in I think it was MIT on cats. Do they I don't know, they're testing shampoos on cats or something. It's what a waste of government funding. So I'm very much hoping that whoever is put in charge of efficiency or the budget is very cutthroat and just cutting all the fat off the government that is completely unnecessary, and hopefully automates everything that can be. Case in point, the DMV. I am very much hater number one of the DMV, and I hope that it gets automated tomorrow. So, personal point. All right, on to more of the international economic side. This is not so much a breakdown of every country, but I do have a few points I wanted to touch on, and more kind of the main countries to keep an eye on over the next few years that I think are really going to have an impact on the U.S. government, U.S. economy, and the world economy as a whole. And just a few kind of key metrics within each one to really keep an eye on. So first and foremost, everybody's favorite, China. They are going through quite a year right now. between the Evergrande collapse. If you don't know, just a quick summary, Evergrande is their largest real estate holdings, and they have gone bankrupt. Think of the equivalent of if JP Morgan went bankrupt, and like how devastating that would be for the U.S. government or for the U.S. economy. Evergrande is like the bread and butter of the Chinese economic system right now, and if they're collapsing, it shows a lot of kind of holes within China. So instead of a lot of people investing in the stock market, like the usual retirement plan is invest in a 401k and the S&P 500, or some of these wealth funds here in the US, and watch your money grow, and maybe a house or two, and then that's what you retire with. In China, nobody trusts the stock market for the last 50 years. So what they did was instead they would buy as much real estate as they possibly could, and they'd over leverage themselves. What the companies like Evergrande and other giant real estate conglomerates did was they way over leveraged themselves, and they got to the point where they would use your money to fund the next project, and they just kept trickling that down to where they ran out of money, but they were still building things, and then now they can't afford to pay those people, and they were cutting shooting themselves in the foot, really. But they were cutting corners at every chance they could, and everybody's taking a little piece of the money along the way. So you get there's a term on the Chinese internet called tofu drag, where what it really means is like you're building these giant 50-story apartment buildings with the equivalent of like tofu or styrofoam, or just very low quality. So if you look up tofu drag on YouTube, you can usually find videos of people quite literally pulling their apartments apart. Like it's supposed to be concrete, but they're just tearing it apart with their own hands because the stuff is so soft and so weak, and that's why a lot of things kind of fall apart in China. And there's the old stereotype of like low quality craftsmanship coming from China. And that's what happens whenever you use, cheap building materials in these giant buildings. So they're building, so it's getting so bad at this point that I read an article recently where some of the salespeople for these were accepting pigs and onions from farmers as down payments for their properties instead of cash, because nobody has any more cash to do that. So keep an eye on the Evergrande scandal. Keep an eye on their stock market is plummeting right now, even worse than normal. Their population, it's always been a little tricky because we've never really gotten like fully accurate numbers from the Communist Party on what their population, like how it's growing or shrinking. But just over the last 2 years, we started getting more accurate than normal numbers on, our population like is shrinking way faster than anybody wanted to report. If you don't know anything about the Communist Party, you are not exactly incentivized to tell the truth. So everybody's beefing up their numbers to make it look like everything's going all right. But you can only lie so many times before the house collapses on itself. Right now, the estimated birth rate of China is 1.18 per woman. To keep a population just stable, not growing, just stable, you need a birth rate of 2.11. So they are very far away from that, and that is the estimated, which could be way overestimating it. There are some people who actually believe right now China's already broken under the 1 billion people mark. So we don't know, but we will see over the next few years, just the shrinking population. The last real point I wanted to make on China is the shrinking startup community they have there. Back when I was in China in 2017, like startups were booming. Shenzhen, Guangzhou, Hong Kong, Shanghai, they were bustling with economic opportunity and startups and technology and everything. I forget the conference name, but there's one conference that it has it's once a year. It's the Chinese like tech conference or showcase, where once a year it's such a large venue. It's like 10 football fields combined of just booths, people showing off the technological innovations that they've had for that year and what they're working on. For context, in 2018, there were over 51,000 businesses registered as startups and like technology startups, 51,000. In 2023, there were 1,200. Right now, they are on track. They have only 260 that have formally registered this year. Like, do you understand how big of a fall that is from the height in 2018 of 51,000? From 51,000 to 260 in a country with an estimated 1 billion people. It's insane. Another piece on there is, so the yuan is the currency of China. In 2017, they had a peak of 125 billion US dollars equivalent invested in via yuan. So in yuan denominated funds, they had $125 billion invested in different VC funds, angel funds, wealth accounts, things like that, to invest in startups. This year, in 2024, was that 7 years later, it's dropped from 125 billion to 5 billion US dollars in yuan. So if that doesn't kind of give you a good picture of where things are at, I don't know what will. The next one I wanted to touch on is, it's not really a country, but it's the BRICS organization. So BRICS stands for Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. But they've also added Iran, Egypt, Ethiopia, and the UAE. And I think there's a few more that they're kind of on the table. Right now, like Russia and China are definitely leading the charge in there. But what they're trying to do is create a whole new currency to kind of rival the US dollar. They were really making some big pushes during Biden's administration. We will see how tough Trump is on them whenever he comes back in. So we'll see. Sounds like they're already making good talks between Putin and Trump about potentially ending the war in Ukraine. So I'm hoping it ends, because I do not like people needlessly dying. Taiwan, major touch point for China again. Not trying to stay on China this whole time, but the biggest factor there is going to be TSMC. You know what? I'm not even going to try to guess. I think it's the Taiwanese semiconductor company. They make all the major, I think they make over like 90% of the semiconductors in the world on that one island. So if something were to happen and China were to take over Taiwan again, like they've been saying they have been for the last few years, then could pose some major downsides for every economy out there. We will see, and I know we are very incentivized to protect Taiwan, since basically all of our technological infrastructure is based on Taiwan staying safe and us continuing to get semiconductors. I think Trump actually just put out a notice asking Taiwan not to sell semiconductors to China anymore. So we'll see. One big thing, one of our closest allies in Japan. If you know anything about Japan and Trump, Shinzo Abe was one of Trump's closest political friends, and he was the former prime minister. He had 4 different stints between the years of 2006 and 2020, kind of off and on. Unfortunately, he was assassinated in 2022. But now they just elected, I think yesterday, Shigeru Ibisha. He's the new prime minister. I think this is his first term. Honestly, I don't know anything about him, so we will have to look more into his record and see, how he's voted in the past and what kind of policies he's running. And hopefully we have another great relationship between him and Trump. This one, I'm going to kind of put both of them in the same category. Japan and South Korea, one thing to keep an eye on is their birth rate. Tons of technological innovation coming out of there, but major challenges when it comes to living in the big cities like Tokyo, Osaka, and Seoul. So we will see, like the price of housing is going through the roof, the price of food is starting to increase again. So it's very hard, and the work cultures are just insane in those countries. So we will see what happens with the birth rate over the next few years, as these countries, it's basically priority number 1 as their populations are shrinking. India is a good one to keep an eye on. They are basically the biggest rival to China right there, and they're also neighbors, so that doesn't help. But they have a birth rate right now of 2.01, so not exactly the 2.11 we need to keep that population up. However, there is a lot of innovation happening in India, in Delhi and Bengaluru. So I don't know, excited to see what happens. I think besides Chinese, I want to say the number one, what's it called, like importer to the U.S. of students is India. So we're training up a lot of engineers and a lot of scientists and a lot of mathematicians from India. And now I think this is the first time in history we're seeing a lot of them going back to India and bringing that innovation back there instead of staying in the U.S. So who knows what's going to happen in the next few years. I'm just going to bunch the EU as a whole. It's too big to go into any individual country right now in this short video, but immigration is going to be one of the biggest problems they have right now, as their social benefit systems are being just wiped out. Social welfare is being wiped out with this mass immigration going on, and they haven't exactly had major growth in their VC funds over the last few years. So we will see. Last two things I really wanted to touch on. Keep your eyes on Latin America. I think a lot of growth is going to come out of there. Specifically, these three markets are going to be Sao Paulo, Brazil, Santiago, Chile, and Bogota, Colombia. We're seeing a lot of innovation and major startup groups exploding in those areas. But three other kind of leaders to keep an eye on in Latin America are Javier Milei, Nayib Bukele, and El Salvador. I'm pretty sure I just butchered that name, but El Salvador's president, Argentina's president, and then the new president in Mexico, Claudia Sheinbaum Pardo. She's the first female president in Mexico, and we will see how things go. I think during Biden's administration, I want to say Mexico surpassed China as our largest trading partner. So very excited to see what comes of that and how we handle, because immigration was one of the biggest key items on this election. So we will see how that is handled with President Claudia Pardo. And then the last one, keep an eye on China. Keep an eye on Africa. Kind of go back to China. We've always, I don't want to call it a Cold War, but the Chinese One Belt, One Road initiative, where they plan to spend over $1 trillion on infrastructure in Africa, has definitely been a major inroad for them to have access to the precious minerals that people have always been taking from Africa. So we will see how that goes. We'll see, how aid goes in Africa in this current term. I don't know. There's a lot of question marks right now in my head for Africa and what's going to happen. And then you got some places like Nigeria and Kenya that there's a lot of innovation. But we'll see, man. I don't know. I need to put more time into looking into Africa and what's happening there. But I know the biggest thing is going to be U.S. aid versus China's One Belt, One Road initiative. And that's a whole other video in itself. So that's it. I'm going to stop talking because my throat hurts now, and I'm going to get back to my meetings with my students. Thank you, and I will see you around. Bye.